Gillian Mollod, very pleased to have you on the Geospatial Index. I have a new angle on recruiting new people on the podcast. It's LinkedIn. So very grateful to have made a connection there. I understand that you are an ESG consultant and geospatial consultant. You have those two tracks going in your career. So I think you can make a really strong contribution here to do with spatial finance. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I thought we would start with a bit of history.
I'll give you first a little background on myself. So I started in the nonprofit world working for a land conservation organization called the Open Space Institute. And when I started working for them, they didn't have a GIS program. So I sort of got trained on the job and started it from scratch. And that was mostly looking at, land conservation areas and, the best areas to conserve based on, where it was in relation to other protected areas and, in terms of protecting, the wilderness around those protected areas and how do you make greenways and stuff like that. So I worked there for a number of years. And then I worked at the Nature Conservancy on a nitrogen, looking at the source of nitrogen pollution in the Long Island Sound. And, at that point, I had sort of felt like, okay, I've done the nonprofit world and I'm ready for change. And I was, looking for a job and I was trying to get out of the nonprofit sector and I was finding it actually quite challenging just because I had such a niche background in land conservation and environmental science with a geospatial lens. So I ended up finding kind of the need to go back to school. So Columbia University has, in their School for Professional Studies, they have a number of programs now, but the one that I did was called Sustainability Management. And it's part of they have this big organization within the university called the Earth Institute. So the Sustainability Management program is a kind of a child of the School of Professional Studies and the Earth Institute. And it's a really interesting program because people come from a variety of backgrounds. People who are working in the fashion industry will come because they want to know how they can make it more sustainable. People who are working in clean energy or clean or kind of environmentally friendly buildings, lead and the like. And then there's people who come with a strong financial background and they're sort of looking more to get the environmental science lens. And then there's people like me who come with the environmental science lens and want to get the financial background. So that's sort of what I studied. I ended up studying sustainable finance and ESG there, and learning more about corporate disclosures, the regulatory environment, and then also kind of how to take my expertise in environmental science and look at businesses and see how they're affected. And so that's something that was new for me. So while yes, you could give anybody with a geospatial background a bunch of data and give them a direction and they can, create the same analysis, understanding both angles is essential. And I think that schooling, that extra schooling was really important for me.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't think of a more renowned university, at least from a finance perspective, than Columbia. As I was talking about before, my hoodie is is about or relates to a short 3-month course about value investing that I did. I've also done personal finance and a product management course there, but it's nothing like the much more rigorous value investing course that Columbia teaches. Okay, so it sounds like you have a very rigorous academic background then that maps onto this and gives you, I guess, a starting point or a lens through which to apply your geospatial skills. And you've got in mind, I suppose, from that course, the sorts of frameworks that assessments from an ESG perspective are done with for corporations. Is that a good way to summarize things?
I will say, the classes that I took, while some of them were more academically rigorous than others, I would say. They gave me a good, strong background, but it really was, my years at MSCI that where I developed a better understanding of the financial systems. I mean, when I first started working at MSCI, I was actually still doing my master's, finishing up my master's.
So it was a master's that you did at
Columbia.
It
was a master's,
okay.
yeah.
And
I definitely was still learning a lot. I mean, it took at least a year to sort of get comfortable with all the terms and learning everything in terms of financial systems. I think that's where I think, yes, the education helped, but it was also my experience. And I think that's one of the things that if you were to say, can anybody create these? Yes, anyone can who has the data, but will they understand what they're really, the point they're trying to get across, and can they, write about it or present on it? And that's where I think you get a little lost without the experience.
Okay, so you've mentioned the term ESG. You've also started to mention MSCI. So I'll take that as a segue into the next item. So ESG Now is an MSCI podcast that's been going since 2018, so a decent number of years now. They're up to 257 episodes, so a lot more than the Geospatial Index. Does this mean that the finance industry is no longer the ravenous, blood-sucking pack of vampires that a good amount of the public thinks it is?
So I'm super glad you mentioned ESG Now, because it sort of the podcast started right around the time that I started at MSCI, so I kind of watched it grow over the years. And at first it was only one host, and with a substitute, and now I think there's 2 regular hosts and then a number of sub hosts. But so it's really grown. I think they have about 5,000 people who listen per week. And I always,
as opposed to 5 for this podcast.
Your number will grow after,
especially with you, Gillian.
Maybe I should just. So I'm friendly with the 2 hosts, so maybe I can get them to sort of put a plug in for your podcast. We'll see. Yeah, so I'll definitely. And I think, you're going to still get your Wolf of Wall Street types. In finance, there's, it's related to money. So, you get sort of the greed with that. And I don't think, especially in the US with the current political climate, I don't think that, ESG is going to take over that quickly. But what I have found working in the ESG space is that the people who dedicate themselves to ESG, even those in the finance world, are dedicated to it for a reason, and they really want to see, environmental change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and good corporate governance. I mean, that's what they're really driving for. And so I think it's a nice. I mean, I think it's where I found my niche in the financial world. I don't think I would, if you asked me, 15 years ago, would you ever work in the financial world? I would probably say no. So the fact that I am there now is I think a really good sign.
Yeah, just the name ESG Now has a sense of urgency to it, and the fact that it's been going for 6 years, to me, those 2 factors just made me feel like actually there's a large finance organization that actually cares. So I thought that was good to flag for those who are kind of new and have some preconceived notions due to movies like the one you mentioned. Yeah. Okay. So I feel we're going well here because you used the word greed as well there, which again is a nice segue to the next item. So you're an example of a scientist from the non-profit space a while ago who gained employment with one of the world's foremost financial firms, MSCI. With scientists like yourself being hired by such large corporations, what are the complications here? Or potential complications in terms of values and expectations about, the impact that large organizations like that should have on the world?
Yeah, so I think it's really been an interesting time to sort of make a segue for me from the nonprofit world to corporate America. And the reason that I think it's the timing is just really coincidental is that when I first got started, any kind of geospatial scientific data was usually created by academic institutions, and it was created to serve other academic institutions or scientists or nonprofit organizations or state and government organizations. It really wasn't ever considered useful to corporates and an investment world. And I think that this and part of that is when you have academic research that's going on, oftentimes there's funding involved, and it's a one-off project, and the person who's doing it just does it once and then they don't update it. So for instance, I'm thinking specifically about biodiversity data, which is a big focus of mine. And for a long time, you could only get biodiversity data that was 10 or 15 years old. And with the kind of climate change and the extreme changes in just Earth systems, and also the new interest from the financial community and corporates in this data, we're seeing that it has to be updated more frequently, at shorter intervals. It has to be commercially available, and so it's a big change. And for scientists, I think the challenge is they're used to slow processes that are peer reviewed, and a lot of times they're now working. There's a lot of scientists working in different startups or different financial data providers like MSCI, and they have the product team who's like, okay, we need to drive this home, we need to get this out, and it's a little bit like, well, but we haven't vetted the data, or and all the data is high caliber scientific data, but the product team's view is, we know this is good data because it's coming from smart scientists, so let's just get it out. And the science team is like, well, no, we have to go through this
there needs to be a 5-year peer review process. Needs to be replicated.
Exactly. And so it's a lot of it's really just sort of a learning curve on both sides, and growing pains is really what it is. But I've seen it in and I talked to different people on both sides, and it's a problem, not a problem, but it's going to take a few years for like everybody to figure it out, and everybody to get comfortable with both sides. And then the other thing that you have is like a lot of scientists aren't commercially driven, and they're not really necessarily great at talking to a broad audience about their subject of interest. So you get on a call with a scientist, and they're talking about stochastic modeling and these things that just the general layperson doesn't really understand, and so you need and that's actually what sort of one point of my expertise is kind of sitting between the two and helping to create digestible information for the science.
I can't help but think that, excuse me for using perhaps having a less sophisticated way of talking about this, but I suppose there might be there's an ideological spectrum, and the stereotype, at least, is that people at university may be more towards the socialist, communist end, and there might be a bit of squeamishness on their part, that the likes of Goldman Sachs or other very large finance firms that are known for exploiting the world in a certain way, they might feel some reluctance in being involved in that. But at the same time, what I feel is that actually what we're seeing is that these large finance firms are being made to spend and invest money in developing these data sets and these services, so that prompt, up to the minute. A wonderful term actually from another podcast with BlackRock and their geospatial team was that as the world turns, it's being assessed and analyzed from a geospatial perspective. And I love the idea that all of these influential, wealthy, powerful firms are being made to participate in what these academics and government-funded programs initially set up.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is a very valid point, and I've actually seen that, because a lot of the data that we've used at MSCI, or that I used when I was at MSCI, I should say, is it comes from the nonprofit world and the scientific community. And a lot of times there's a great concern, like if we provide this data, to a large financial institution, what are they going to do with it? And how are they going to use it? And how are they going to recommend that it's used by their client base? I think that's actually one of the other challenges, is sort of like getting getting clear prescriptive directions from the science community on how to use the data. I think that sort of is one of the things that that is a bit of a challenge, and that's a little bit of a disconnect between the two communities. So yeah, you're not alone in those thoughts.
Yeah, it doesn't directly map onto this, but at least I was reminded when you were talking before about how Tesla made a lot of its money early on. As I understand it, it wasn't from selling cars; it was from the credits that they got from they sold carbon credits to competitor car manufacturers. So effectively, their competitors were made to fund Tesla because the government required them to offset the emissions essentially caused by their internal combustion cars. I don't know, it just somehow it reminded me of this, that, as I said, these larger corporations are somehow being brought to heel in a way, it seems. So I hope this is a sign that people can feel more comfortable contributing and devoting their lives to these sorts of firms, so long as they're doing this sort of thing.
Yes. And I can say, from being on the inside, MSCI at least, and I can say I have a lot of colleagues at other organizations and even at financial institutions, like, everyone's trying to use the data in the best possible way, and really trying. I mean, I think there's a universal goal, is to drive changes. It's like an exciting time to be in this field for sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we better get down to the nuts and bolts and actually talk about a unit of account, if you like, that matters for spatial finance. So the topic of physical assets comes up regularly whenever I have a spatial finance type guest on. And that's all the way back since the first one, really, with Will Cadell of Spark Geo. So could you tell me why physical assets is the thing that seems to be at the base of all of these spatial finance assessments? What is the importance of known physical asset locations to this discipline? What if they're all just points? So what I understand is that often it's a house or building footprint, but what if we just use points instead, as one of my sort of sub questions? And what if we went over to volumes, or solids, of including the height of the building? Would that change the way spatial finance analyses are done?
Yeah, I honestly could probably talk on this topic for an hour, so I'll try to keep it short. But just because you gave such great examples about a house, a building, and the height and volume of a building, I'll just sort of start there. If you think about it, geospatial science is essentially, we're trying to create a digital twin of the globe, of the planet, right? And so in doing that, a point isn't going to give you the sort of attributes of the building that you really need to have a good sense of what's going on at the site. So if you think about it, a house can be a huge mansion, or it could be a one-story house, right? They're very different, right? And then if you think of a building can be, a small apartment building. It can be a high-rise. It can be a mall. It can be an airport, right? So, and the height everything's important, from the space it occupies to the height, and to what's inside the building, right? So I like to give the example of the MSCI office in New York City, because MSCI occupies, like, I think at this point it's two floors of this large office building, and Moody's occupies like 3 floors of the same building, and then there's a large law firm and small companies, right? So there's a lot of people in this one building.
There's some geospatial intelligence.
Right, yeah. But when you're looking at it from a physical climate risk perspective, right? And you're trying to say, how much value of this building is at risk, to a company that's in that building, you have to understand, the management company of the building, the space that all the occupants occupy, and how many people are working there. Like, there's so many intricacies that you need to know. So that's just like one example, right? But really, to like sort of get the full picture, if you're looking at, let's say you're looking at pollution, and you have just a point, and you're trying to figure out what's the likely amount of pollution that's happening at the site. You need more information to get that. And so, one of the things that I loved, and was like my favorite thing to work with at MSCI, was what was called the asset location database, and now it's called MSCI Geospatial. But literally, it's this data set of corporate locations of companies, and it's points. But within that, it has information like if it's a power plant, if it's a mine, if it's a office building. And I will say there's a lot of asset location databases out there. There's a number of companies who create them, and they're all imperfect. They're just all imperfect. And they're imperfect for a number of reasons. One is because corporate disclosure of locations is poor, right? So you don't really know where all their locations are. They might have their, company will be like, yes, we've disclosed all our offices. Here's our headquarters, and there's our offices, and we're done. Yeah, it's like, but then they have these manufacturing plants, or they have storage facilities, or they don't even own, they rent in a place, where they, so there's all these like little connections and intricacies there as well. So really, I think the central goal in really understanding everything from environmental issues to social justice issues is really understanding everything that's going on in that building. Yeah. If it's a building that's, I mentioned social justice, it's a building that pollutes, right? What's the neighborhood around it like?
Yeah. There's a couple. So I was really excited when you used the term digital twin, not because it's a buzzword or there's a bit of buzziness around it. But the reason why I was excited is because I got the feeling that there might be an arms race between all of these large financial firms, S&P Global, Moody's, MSCI, Refinitiv, all of them. Is there an arms race between them to develop a digital twin of the world?
I would say probably to some degree, but I don't think a lot of them are creating digital twins. I think they're trying to create data sets that have a lot of information on companies and corporate locations, but they're not necessarily a digital twin. I think that the big tech firms like Microsoft and Google, they're the ones sort of working on the digital twin.
Okay, so they buy that.
Smaller startups. Yeah, and there's smaller startups that are doing like building footprints and combining that with satellite data and stuff like that. But a lot of these financial firms are just more interested in the asset location and not so much in the full digital twin.
Okay, so those smaller firms or those startups that might be creating building footprint or selling those services, the likes of MSCI will be more likely to not buy a 2D polygon type data set. They'd be more interested in a multi-patch version or a solid.
Yeah. Okay. And one thing I forgot to point out when I was talking earlier about just knowing the details of a building is the building's footprint. And one of the things, as I've done more on biodiversity, one of the things that I've learned is it's not just the building footprint, it's also the land footprint around the building.
Right.
And so, you take, for example, you take, you look at a mine, and a mine could have 10 buildings, but really the impact is 2 kilometers wide.
Yeah.
And beyond that, of course, because of the impacts from
essentially the rehabilitation area that they are legally required to restore. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. But and then you look at a power plant, and it especially a hydropower plant or a wind power plant, and the footprint isn't always just the building, but of course there is the importance of knowing the footprint of the building and the land footprint as well.
Okay, all right. I'm feeling a segue coming on.
Go for it.
So, extending this further, how is geospatial data being used in finance? And by extension, how is the geospatial industry itself impacting financial markets? Can financial analysts make money anymore without geospatial?
I mean, I think I'd have a lot more money if the financial institutions couldn't make money without
Okay,
geospatial. I
damn it.
believe they still can make tons of money without geospatial, but geospatial is really right now it's being used most in risk and looking at risk, and also into answering regulations. So I think the two biggest uses are understanding physical climate risks, and that's super big and for commercial real estate and banks and insurance, and also for corporates who are trying to understand what their risks are, and it's also in the regulatory sense, it's understanding, answering some of the questions that are coming out around physical risk, especially because those are already sort of on the table, especially in Europe. A lot of banks have to answer to certain regulations on where their physical climate risks are. And then in the biodiversity, in terms of biodiversity, there's I don't know if you're familiar with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, but that was released in
Taking
September.
notes.
Sorry?
I'm taking notes as you speak.
Oh, taking notes. Okay. So yeah, and the TNFD is sort of TCFD is the climate regulation that was adopted by the ISSB, and the TNFD is expected to also be eventually adopted by the ISSB. So it'll kind of be a joint disclosure with the TCFD, hopefully down the road. But the idea is really for companies to disclose on their impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities around biodiversity. So
And geospatial is involved in those disclosures.
Geospatial is so intricately involved in.
Yep.
So the TNFD has this thing called the LEAP process, and I won't go into that because it's the whole to do. But the L of LEAP stands for locate, and it's essentially locate your interface with nature. So it's asking corporations and the investors who invest in them to talk about the impacts they have on nature. So it's a really important disclosure in terms of biodiversity. And the I attended the launch in New York City at the stock exchange, and I was standing in the stock exchange with like pictures of bees. I have you can find a photo of me on LinkedIn with I purposely wore this bright spring flowery dress.
I'm jealous.
I went all in, but yeah, and it was really.
You have to send that photo for the podcast.
I will. But it was like I remember sitting there and looking around this room and talking to the people, and the people who were around me. There was this guy, I think he was from I can't remember if it was North or South Dakota, but he was from one of the Dakotas, but he was working in Africa. And then there was a guy, a diplomat from Africa next to me. Yeah. And then there was just people from all over. And then, talking to all these people from the UK who were there, because that's really where this stuff started.
Yeah.
But just, there were people from everywhere and all walks of life.
But hang on. So we can say legitimately that your geospatial career took you to the New York Stock Exchange. That's all I wanted. Perfect.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
It. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
that's legit.
So, yeah.
All right. I'm just aware of time, so I wanted to get through as many as we could. So I think listeners will especially like this one. So take us through a day in the life of a spatial finance analyst. Perhaps you can talk to this point in the context of producing the map about commercial property in Hurricane Ian's path. Was this done in response to any presidents wielding Sharpies?
Yes, that's a great question. I love that. Yeah, if he can draw a map, anyone can, right?
At least the geospatial analyst, damn it, should respond.
Yeah, and it is kind of funny if you look at the map you're talking about and you think about his Sharpie. It's That's great. I love it. So yeah, so essentially, I'll tell you how that I think was like a LinkedIn. So it was kind of more to get a wow and gimmicky than it was like real like research, scientific research. But it was a lot of fun to work on. It was somebody from real estate research department who I work with a lot. He reached out to me, and because I had made one the year before for Hurricane Laura, which is also on LinkedIn, and it was the one for Hurricane Laura was using the MSCI's asset location database and looking at what sectors were most exposed to that hurricane. And then when we did the Ian one, it was using our commercial, using MSCI's commercial real estate data. And essentially, you know, some in the climate community would say that that's not really using climate modeling, because it wasn't climate modeling per se. It was the predicted path of the hurricane, which is sort of more like now and present rather than thinking about 10, 15 years in the future.
It's an output of the current climate, so
it's
I'll
an
take
output
it.
of the current. Exactly right. I think so too.
Someone has to do it.
So essentially, what I did was, you know, I got this data on all these buildings in the U.S. and and NOAA has a great hurricane, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, I think.
Administration.
Administration. Don't quote me on any of that.
It's the second podcast, second episode in 3 that this has come up. So I'm realizing the importance of this agency. So
yeah, we'll just call it NOAA. So they have this great hurricane page for it's all geospatial data, and essentially it has all past hurricanes, but it has if there's a hurricane coming, and I've heard that this hurricane season, this upcoming hurricane season, is going to be a big one. So this will be an exciting little here's how to do it if you want to do it on your own.
Yeah.
But they have, so about 5 days before the hurricane, they start predicting the path, and that you can download daily. You can download, and they might even release 2 a day. I don't know. They can download the shape file or whatever kind of vector data set you want to download. I think they have various versions. And so you can get the sort of the daily predicted path. And so I think that was a few days beforehand, and we I got the path, and then I joined it with the data from the commercial real estate, and then we just identified which building types were most susceptible.
And you could sum the values. Does that data set have the value of each of those buildings?
Yeah, I might have the values. I can't remember, but if we have, so you essentially. So if you take, so we had things like what type of building it was, the financial value, or I think it's the current market value. So you
could start to predict things like the cost of the hurricane. I mean, it makes. I've just got this animation in mind, of the weather report, and it could be much more interesting, instead of just showing, where it's going to be. It could be the cost of this particular track of the hurricane. It's fascinating. But that's a proprietary data set from MSCI, right? That's how they derive gain a competitive advantage. So you could pay for that.
Exactly. I mean, the hurricane stuff is for everybody, but the building stuff is not.
Because it's a nice accompaniment, this discussion, to the previous episode that I'm still editing for Spatial Risk Systems, where they also have similar data sets that aggregate up from building footprints and then all the way up to a stock ticker, really. Fascinating. Okay. I would love to keep talking about stories from the trenches, but unfortunately we've got to get on to the next one. But yeah, we'll see how we go. Maybe we can come back for more. But okay, so do analysts at MSCI basically map and analyze different countries and regions of the world day by day each week? I asked because another example output of yours was most prevalent climate hazards in the Asia Pacific. This is fascinating. Did it ever get overwhelming, though, having to be across so many different parts of the world? Basically, it looks like you were analyzing the planet, and it seemed like it'd be overwhelming, the different details locally.
Yeah. So the nice thing about working in the in the Climate Risk Center at MSCI was that I work with a number of climate scientists. And so there's a well-developed physical risk climate model and transition risk, but I was on the physical risk team. And so there's already the data that's there. So, there's data, they looked at 10 different hazards, 5 acute and 5 chronic. Just to, the acute are those that are event-driven, like a hurricane or a wildfire, and the chronic are those that are, take longer to manifest, so like extreme heat and changes in precipitation. So the data's all there. So it's just really a matter of, pulling the data from the region. So, I mean, that was actually an interesting, the one that I think it was, we called it a quick take that you referred to. We created I created a few of them with people from the ESG research team who are based in the APAC region. And there was a climate conference last year, right around this time, that was happening and I want to say it was in Hong Kong, but I might be wrong, but I believe it was in Hong Kong. And our CEO was going to be present, so they wanted to do some fun stuff, and that was one of them. So it looks like it was, a whole bunch of research went into it, but a lot of it was already just sort of taking data we already had and just making it specific to the region.
Yeah. Nevertheless, from an outsider, it looks very exciting. You can just, today I'm going to Indonesia. Today I'm going to Mongolia.
Yeah, that's the idea.
And just to have the data.
I mean, that's the great thing about, if you have geospatial data, you can go around the globe. Obviously, I just want to point out. Yeah, exactly. I do want to point out one thing, though, with global consistent models, you do tend to lose some resolution and some, granularity, which I think is also important to note. Like, I think it's super important to have both global climate models and also regionally specific climate models, especially for areas that are often impacted.
Yeah. Nevertheless, as another sort of example of the detail that you were able to include in your reports, remember another one where you assessed again, getting back to property and commercial property, you assessed I guess the value at risk from a property perspective around the world and a number of well-known urban centres. I'm currently sitting about 300 meters from the Thames in London, and I remember one of your assessments, you said if it wasn't for the Thames barrier, or essentially the massive flood protection system along the Thames, the risk to commercial property in London would be far higher. So it was just nice to see, in my own professional life, I have become aware of the significant projects that last for a century, really, into the future, that are involved in maintaining this barrier. So it was just interesting to see the work that you did captured this sort of detail, and it impressed me that it made these sort of reports illustrate the resources that you're able to bring to bear on these questions at a global scale, but still capturing those local details.
Yeah. I'll just tell you one quick story. Is shortly after that paper came out, it was in 2019, and I went to a conference. An MSCI held a conference in London and had a bunch of different researchers talking at it, and I was invited to come. So I was in London for a few days, and one of the guys that I worked with, who was in their commercial real estate research department, he told me that I think it was a friend or a relative had gotten stuck at a mall because this mall in about an hour north of London had flooded, and people couldn't actually get out of the mall and into their cars. Like they had to, it was like this whole crazy thing. And I mean, not that you want to predict doom and gloom, but like, he was like, we predicted that property was at risk for flooding.
Yes, we're successful predicting disaster.
I've joked around with people. I'm like, this isn't why we're in this, to say like, we told you so. But I mean, it was a little bit of like, it did feel good.
Right, there you go. Yeah. Again, love those stories from the trenches. Okay, so Unfortunately, we've reached the last question. I'm so sorry. I don't want things to end, but here it is. So you've left MSCI. So what's the future for you? If you came across someone else keen to set up a spatial finance consultancy, driven, for example, by Nick Smith's comments that a hot application of GeoInt skills is spatial finance, would you be down to join them?
So this is a great question because I'm currently trying to sort of figure out my next steps. I'm doing some consultancy work right now for a really cool biodiversity startup in the US called Flint Pro. They do a lot of carbon accounting and GHG emissions, and they're moving into the biodiversity space now as well. You know, I'm sort of, you know, just talking to a lot of people and trying to figure out my next permanent steps. This is just like a temporary consulting thing. But I, you know, and it's brand new. I literally started last week. So consultancy is definitely something that's of interest to me. I would always welcome a conversation with someone, but I don't know that I don't know that that's where I want to land.
Yeah. Oh, cool. We are not only on this podcast advertising businesses, but also
advertising people.
We'll see how it goes.